The Wind and the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Chapter 7. The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The willow wren was twittering his thin little song, hidden himself in the dark selvage of the riverbank. Though it was past 10 o'clock at night, the sky still clung to and retained some of the lingering skirts of light from the departed day, and the sullen heats of the torrid afternoon broke up and rolled away at the dispersing touch of the cool fingers of the short midsummer night. Mole lay stretched on the bank, still panting from the stress of the fierce day that had been cloudless from dawn to late sunset, and waited for his friend to return. He had been on the river with some companions, leaving the water rat free to keep an engagement of long standing with the otter, and had come back to find the house dark and deserted, with no sign of Rat, who doubtless was keeping it up late with his old comrade. It was still too hot to think of staying indoors, so he lay on some cool dock leaves and thought over the past day and its doings, and how very good they had been. The rat's light footfall was presently heard approaching over the parched grass. "Oh, the blessed coolness," he said, and sat down, gazing thoughtfully into the river, silent and preoccupied. "You stayed to supper, of course," said Mole presently. "Simply had to," said the rat. "They wouldn't hear of me going before. You know how kind they always are, and they make things as jolly for me as ever they could, right up to the moment I left. But I felt a brute all the time, as it was clear to me that they were very unhappy, though they tried to hide it. Mole, I'm afraid they're in trouble. Little Portly is missing again, and you know what a lot his father thinks of him, though he never says much about it." "What, that child?" said the Mole lightly. "Well, I suppose he is. Why worry about it? He's always strayed off and getting lost, and turning up again. He's so adventurous. But no harm ever happens to him. Everybody hereabouts knows him, and likes him, just as they do old Otter. And you may be sure some animal or other will come across him and bring him back again all right. Why, we found him ourselves, miles from home, and quite self-possessed and cheerful." "Yes, but this time it's more serious," said the rat gravely. "He's been missing for some days now, and the otters have hunted everywhere, high and low, without finding the slightest trace. They've asked every animal, too, for miles around, and no one knows anything about him. Otter's evidently more anxious than he'll admit. I got out of him that young Portly hasn't learned to swim very well yet, and I can see that he's thinking of the weir. There's a lot of water coming down still, considering this time of year, and the place always has a fascination for the child. And then there are, well, traps and things, you know. Otter's not the fellow to be nervous about a son of his before it's time, and now he is nervous. When I left, he came out with me, said he wanted some air, and talked about stretching his legs. But I could see it wasn't that, so I drew it out of him, and asked him, and got it all from him at last. He was going to spend the night watching by the ford. You know the place where the old ford used to be, in bygone days, before they built the bridge?" "I know it well," said the Mole. "But why should Otter choose to watch there?" "Well, it seems that it was there that he gave Portly his first swimming lesson," continued the rat. "From that shallow, gravelly spit near the bank. And it was there he used to teach him fishing, and there young Portly caught his first fish, of which he was so very proud. The child loved the spot, and Otter thinks that if he came wandering back from wherever he is, if he goes anywhere this time, poor little chap, he might make it for the ford he was so fond of. Or if he came across, he'd remember it well, and stop there and play perhaps. So Otter goes there every night and watches, on the chance, you know, just on the chance." There was silence for a long time, both thinking of the same thing, lonely, heart-sore animal, crouched by the ford, watching and waiting, the long night through, on the chance. "Well, well," said the rat presently, "I suppose we ought to be thinking about turning in." But he never offered to move. "Rat," said the mole, "I simply can't go and turn in and go to sleep and do nothing, even though there doesn't seem anything to be done. We'll get the boat out and paddle upstream. The moon will be up in about an hour or so, and then we will search, and as well as we can anyhow. It will be better than going to bed and doing nothing." "Just what I was thinking myself," said the rat. "It's not the sort of night for bed anyhow, and daybreak is not so very far off, and then we may pick up some news from the early risers, as we go along." They got the boat out, and Rat took the sculls, paddling with caution. Out in the midstream there was a clear, narrow track that faintly reflected the sky, but wherever shadows fell on the water from the bank, bush, or tree, they were as solid as all appearances as banks themselves, and the mole had to steer with judgment accordingly. Dark and deserted as it was, the night was full of small noises, song and chatter and rustling, telling of a busy little population who were up and about, plying their trades and vocations through the night till sunshine should fall on them at last and send them all off to a well-earned repose. The water's own noises, too, were more apparent than by day, its gurglings and its gloops more unexpected and near to hand, and constantly they started at what seemed a sudden clear call from an actual articulate voice. The line of the horizon was clear and hard against the sky, and in one particular quarter it showed black against a silvery climbing phosphorescence that grew and grew. At last, over the rim of the waiting earth, the moon lifted with slow majesty, till it swung clear of the horizon and rode off, free of its moorings. And once more they began to see surfaces, meadows widespread, and quiet gardens, and the river itself from bank to bank, all softly disclosed, all washed clean of mystery and terror, all radiant again as by day, but with the difference that was tremendous. Their old haunts greeted them again in other raiments, as if they had slipped away and put on this pure new apparel, and come quietly back, smiling as they shyly waited to see if they would be recognized again under it. Fastening their boat to a willow, the friends landed in the silent silver kingdom, and patiently explored the hedges, the hollow trees, the runnels, and their little culverts, the ditches, and the dry waterways. Embarking again, and crossing over, they worked their way up the stream in this manner, while the moon, serene and detached in a cloudless sky, did what she could, though so far off, to help them in their quiet, till her hour came and she sank earthwards reluctantly and left them, and mystery once more held field and river. Then a change began to slowly declare itself. The horizon became clearer, field and tree came more into sight, and somehow with a different look. The mystery began to drop away from them. A bird piped suddenly, and was still, and a light breeze sprang up and set the reeds and the bulrushes rustling. Rat, who was at the stern of the boat while Mole sculled, sat up suddenly and listened with a passionate intentness. Mole, who with gentle strokes was keeping the boat moving while he scanned the banks with care, looked at him with curiosity. "It's gone," sighed the rat, sinking back into his seat again. "So beautiful and strange and new. Since it was to end soon, I almost wish I had never heard it, for it had roused a longing in me that is pain, and nothing worth while but just to hear that sound once more and go on listening to it forever. No, there it is again," he cried, alert once more. Entranced, he was silent for a long space, spellbound. Now it passes on, and I begin to lose it, he said presently. Oh, Mole, the beauty of it, the merry bubble and joy, the thin, clear, happy call of the distant piping. Such music I never dreamt of, and the call in it is stronger even than the music is sweet. Row on, Mole, for the music and the call must be for us. The Mole, greatly wondering, obeyed. I hear nothing myself, he said, but the wind played in the reeds and rushes and osiers. The Rat never answered, if indeed he heard. Rapt, transported, trembling, he was possessed in all his senses by this new divine thing that caught up his helpless soul and swung and dangled it, a powerless but happy infant, in a strong, sustaining grasp. In silence, Mole rowed steadily, and soon they came to a point where the river divided, a long backwater branching off to one side. With a slight movement of his head, Rat, who had long dropped the rudder lines, directed the rower to take the backwater. The creeping tide of the light gained, and now they could see the colour of the flowers that gemmed the water's edge. Clearer and nearer still, cried the Rat joyously. Now you must surely hear it, at last. I see you do. Breathless and transfixed, the Mole stopped rowing as the liquid run of their glad piping broke on him like a wave, caught him up, and possessed him utterly. He saw the tears on his comrade's cheek, and bowed his head and understood. For a space they hung there, brushed by the purple loose strife that fringed the bank. Then the clear, imperious summons that marched hand in hand with the intoxicating melody imposed its will on Mole, and mechanically he bent to his oars again. And the light grew steadily stronger, but no birds sang, as they were wont to do at the approach of dawn. And but for the heavenly music, all was marvellously still. On either side of them, as they glided onwards, the rich meadow grass seemed that morning of freshness and of greenness unsurpassed. Never had they noticed the roses so vivid, the willow herb so richeous, the meadow sweet, so odorous and pervading. Then the murmur of the approach weir began to hold the air, and they felt consciousness that they were nearing the end, whatever it might be, that surely awaited their expedition. A wide half-circle of foam, and glinted lights and shining shoulders of green water, the great weir closed to the backwater from bank to bank. Troubled the all-quiet surface with twirling eddies and floating foam streaks, and deadened all other sounds with its solemn and soothing rumble. In the midmost stream, embraced in the weir's shimmering arms spread, a small island lay anchored, fringed close with the willow and the silver birch and the alder. Reserved, shy, but full of significance, it hid whatever it might hold behind a veil, keeping it till the hour should come, and, with the hour, those who were called and chosen. Slowly, but with no doubt or hesitation whatsoever, and in something of a solemn expectancy, the two animals passed through the broken, tumultuous water, and moored their boat at the flowery margin of the island. In silence they landed, and pushed through the blossom and the scented herbage and the undergrowth that led up to this level ground, till they stood on a little lawn of marvellous green, set round with nature's own orchard trees, crab-apple, wild cherry, and sloe. "This is the place of my song-dream, the place the music played to me," whispered the Rat, as if in a trance. "Here in this holy place, here if anywhere, surely we shall find him." Then suddenly the Mole felt a great awe fall upon him, an awe that turned his muscles to water, bowed his head, and rooted his feet to the ground. It was no panic terror. Indeed, he felt wonderfully at peace and happy. But it was an awe that smote and held him, and without seeing, he knew it could only mean that some august presence was very, very near. With difficulty he turned and looked at his friend, and saw him by his side, cowed, stricken, and trembling violently. And still there was utter silence in the populous bird-haunted branches around them, and still the light grew and grew. Perhaps he would never have dared to raise his eyes, but that, though the piping was now hushed, the call and the summons seemed still dominant and imperious. He might not refuse were Death himself waiting to strike him instantly. Once he had looked with mortal eyes on things rightly kept hidden. Trembling he obeyed, and raised his humble head, and then, in that utter clearness of the imminent dawn, while nature, flushed with fullness of incredible colour, seemed to hold her breath for the event, he looked in very eyes of friend and helper, saw the backward sweep of the curved horns gleaming in the growing daylight, saw the stern, hooked nose between the kindly eyes that were looking down on them humorously, while the bearded mouth broke into a half-smile at the corners, saw the rippling muscles of the arm that lay across the broad chest, the long, supple hand still holding the panpipes, only just fallen away from the parted lips, saw the splendid curves of her shaggy limbs disposed in majestic ease, and the swan, saw, last of all, nestling between his very hooves, sleeping soundly in entire peace and contentment, the little round, podgy, childish baby otter. All this he saw for one moment, breathless and intense, vivid on the morning sky, and still, as he looked, he lived, and still, as he lived, he wondered. "Rat," he found breath to whisper, shaking, "are you afraid?" "Afraid?" murmured the rat, his eyes shining with unnotable love. "Afraid of him? Oh, never, oh, never! And yet, oh, Mole, I am afraid." Then the two animals, crouching to the earth, bowed their heads and did worship. Sudden and magnificent, the sun's broad golden disk showed itself over the horizon facing them, and the first rays shooting across the level water meadows took the animals full in the eyes and dazzled them. When they were able to look once more, the vision had vanished, and the air was full of carol of birds that hailed the dawn. As they stared blankly, in dumb misery deepening as they slowly realized all that they had seen and all that they had lost, a capricious little breeze dancing up from the surface of the water tossed the aspens, shook the dewy roses, and blew lightly and caressingly in their faces, and with its soft touch came the instant oblivion. For this is the last best gift that the kindly demigod is careful to bestow on those whom which he reveals himself in their helping, the gift of forgetfulness. Lest the awful remembrance should remain and grow and overshadow mirth and pleasure, and the great haunting memory should spoil all that after lives or the little animals helped out of difficulties, in order that they should be happy and light-hearted as before. Mole rubbed his eyes and stared at Rat, who was looking about at him in a puzzled sort of way. "I beg your pardon. What did you say, Rat?" he asked. "I think I was only remarking," said Rat slowly, "that this was the right sort of place, and that here, if anywhere, we should find him. And look! Why, there he is, the little fellow!" And with a cry of delight he ran towards the slumbering Portly. But Mole stood still a moment, held in thought, as one waking suddenly from a beautiful dream, who struggles to recall it, and can recapture nothing but a dim sense of the beauty of it, the beauty, till that too fades away in its turn, and the dream bitterly accepts the hard cold waking and all its penalties, So Mole, after struggling with his memory for a brief space, shook his head sadly and followed Rat. Portly woke up with a joyous squeak and wriggled with pleasure at the sight of his father's friends, who had played with him so often in the past days. In a moment, however, his face grew blank, and he fell to hunting around in a circle with a pleading whine, as a child that has fallen happily asleep in its nurse's arms, and wakes to find itself alone and laid in a strange place, and searches the corners and the cupboards, and the runs in the room to room, despair growing silently in its heart. Even so, Portly searched the island and searched, dogged and unwavering, till the last black moment came for giving up and sitting down and crying bitterly. The Mole ran quickly to comfort the little animal, but Rat, lingering, looked long and doubtfully at certain hoof marks deep in the sward. "Some great animal has been here," he murmured, slowly and thoughtfully, and stood musing, his mind strangely stirred. "Come along, Rat," called the Mole. "Think of the poor otter waiting up there by the ford." Portly had soon been comforted by the promises of a treat, a jaunt on the river in Mr. Rat's real boat, and the two animals conducted him to the waterside, placed him securely between them in the bottom of the boat, and paddled off down the water. The sun was fully up by now, so hot on them. Birds sang lustily and without restraint, and the flowers smiled and nodded from either bank. But somehow, so thought the animals, with less richness and blaze of colour than they seemed to remember seeing quite recently somewhere. They wondered where. The main river reached again, and they turned the boat's head upstream towards the point where they knew their friend was keeping his lonely vigil. As they drew near to the familiar ford, the Mole took the boat into the bank, and then they lifted Portly out and set him on his legs on the towpath, gave him his marching orders and a friendly farewell and a pat on the back, and shoved out into the midstream. They watched the little animal as he waddled along the path contentedly, and with importance watched him till they saw his muzzle suddenly lift and his waddle break into a clumsy amble as he quickened his pace with shrill whines and wriggles of recognition. Looking up the river, they could see the otter start up, tense and rigid, from out of the shadows where he had crouched in dumb patience, and he could hear amazed and joyous bark as he bounded up through the osiers on the path. Then Mole, with a strong pull of one oar, swung the boat round to let the full stream bear them down again, whither it would, their quest now happily ended. "I feel strangely tired, Rat," said the Mole, leaning wearily over his oars as the boat drifted. "It's being up all night, you'll say, perhaps, but that's nothing. We do as much half the nights of the week at this time of year. No, I feel as if I've been through something very exciting and rather terrible, and it was just over, and yet nothing particular has happened. Or something very surprised and splendid and beautiful," murmured the Rat, leaning back and closing his eyes. "I feel just as you do, Mole, simply dead tired, though not body tired. It's lucky we've got the stream with us to take us home. Isn't it jolly to feel the sun again, soaking into one's bones, and hark to the wind playing in the reeds? It's like the music far away, music," said the Mole, nodding drowsily. "So I was thinking," murmured the Rat, dreamful and languid. "Dance music, the lilting sort that runs on without stop, but with the words in it, too. It passes into words and out of them again. I catch them at intervals. Then it's the dance music once more. Then nothing but the reeds, soft, thin whisperings." "You hear better than I," said Mole sadly. "I cannot catch words." "Let me try and give you them," said the Rat softly, his eyes still closed. Now it's turning into words again, faint but clear. Lest the oar should dwell, and turn your frolic to fret, you shall look on my power at the helping hour, but then you shall forget. Now the reeds take it up, forget, forget, they sigh, and it all dies away in a rustling and a whisper. Then the voice returns, lest limbs be reddened and rent, I spring the trap that is set. As I lose the snare you may glimpse me there, for surely you shall forget. Row nearer, mole, nearer to the reeds. It's hard to catch, the growing each minute fainter. Helper, healer, I cheer, small waifs in the woodland wet. Strays I find in it, wound I bind in it, biding them, all forgetting. Nearer, mole, nearer. No, it is no good, the song has died away into reed talk. But what do the words mean? Asked the wondering mole. That I do not know, said the rat simply. I pass them on to you as they reach me. Ah, now they return again, and this time full and clear. This time at last it is the real, the unmistakable thing, simple, passionate, perfect. Well, let's have it then, said the mole, after he had waited patiently for a few minutes, half dozing in the hot sun. But no answer came. He looked and understood the silence, with a smile of much happiness on his face, and something of the listening look still lingered there. The weary rat was fast asleep.